Hey, Wellness Warriors, welcome to the Burnout Resolution Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mylaine Riobé. As an integrative medical doctor over the last 20 plus years, I've helped thousands of clients beat burnout and fatigue symptoms using integrative functional or what we call holistic strategies. Many clients don't necessarily have stressful or toxic work environments. Some haven't even started working yet and are still in school. We don't have statistics for this, unfortunately, but I would say at least 8 out of every 10 clients that I see for burnout have some kind of gastrointestinal symptoms. And they may or may not think those symptoms are abnormal. In fact, sometimes I have to dig and dig with them into their symptoms to even get them to realize that they're having any gastrointestinal symptoms at all. Many of them deny that they're actually having any GI symptoms, and they say that their bowel movements are normal, they don't have any abdominal pain or discomfort. But then when I kept probing, what I came to realize over the years is that so many people normalize their gastrointestinal symptoms, either because they've had them for so long that they think they're normal, or they've been evaluated and told that there's nothing wrong, and so they think they're normal because they're told there's nothing wrong. And so when we ask them if they have any GI symptoms, they'll just say no. Or the other thing that I've noticed that's striking is that if they've had GI symptoms for a long time, they become very intelligent about what is triggering their symptoms. They slowly begin to remove a bunch of different foods from their diets, and they end up on these restrictive diets, but they don't have any symptoms anymore. So then when you ask them if they have any GI symptoms, they'll say no. But they'll forget that they had to eliminate so many foods from their diet to get rid of those symptoms. It's incumbent upon the physician to really probe. And what I've seen over the last 20 years is burnout almost never exists without a gastrointestinal issue. Now, often that issue might not have a name. You may get evaluated. You may have a colonoscopy, an endoscopy, a CAT scan, and everything comes back normal. Blood work's normal. So you don't get to actually name the thing that you have, but yet you still have GI symptoms. Now, what are these symptoms? It could be anything from a little bit of heartburn, nausea, with or without meals. Sometimes people have underlying nausea that never quite goes away. Sometimes it's associated with meals. I had one young lady recently tell me that it's only when she took her medications that she had nausea. Or I recently had a young lady come in with what she described as chest pain. And so she distinctly did not have any burning, but she had this kind of dull ache, stabbing discomfort for years. And she had been evaluated by multiple specialists, including a cardiologist, but she was never referred to a gastroenterologist. So even a symptom of chest pain can be gastrointestinal. Other people relay nausea or even vomiting. Bloating is a huge one that should never be ignored. So whether it's a gassy sensation of bloating or a feeling of heaviness that leads to the bloating, none of this is normal. Also, people think that their norm is normal. So they'll think that because they've had constipation since childhood, that that's normal. But it's not. We should have about 2 to 3 bowel movements every single day. And they should be well formed, the consistency of a ripe banana, but brown. There should be no flecks of food in there. You shouldn't see like green flecks, black flecks, red flecks in your stool. It should be uniformly brown, and there should be no mucus in the stool. The other thing is your stool should sink to the bottom of the bowl, not float on the surface of the water. If your stools float, then that means there's either a bunch of gas in your stools or fat in your stools from not absorbing your food. And then there is the episodes of loose stools that people may have from time to time. Sometimes it's as mild as only when you're having your menstrual cycle, for example. So when people have symptoms associated with their menstrual cycles, they assume that they're hormonal and not gastrointestinal, but they can be both. It's really important for integrative physicians to mine into people's symptoms. Otherwise, they tend to gloss over them. And it's not their fault that they're glossing over them. Many of my clients have presented to their physicians with these symptoms, but simply were not able to get answers, even when they were referred to a specialist. And so they thought that they had exhausted all options. and that they just had to deal with their symptoms and live with it. This is where they start avoiding the foods and the things that create the symptoms. And then that'll work for a little while, and then the symptoms almost always will come back. It could be a few months later, it could be a year later, and then they'll keep restricting even more to the point where they're barely eating enough variety to maintain normal health. And they just feel horrible. They get more and more fatigued, and they just feel lousier and lousier. There are other symptoms that are peripheral to the GI symptoms, and that's usually what drives them into the office. So they'll come in with fatigue, right? Because that's the main symptom of burnout. They're exhausted. No matter how much sleep they get, they don't feel rested in the mornings, or they crash and burn at some point during their day. Anxiety is a huge one as well. And we'll talk about why GI symptoms cause anxiety, and also why anxiety can cause GI symptoms. It becomes this chicken and egg game that makes it even more confusing. Weight gain as well, from the inflammation and the low metabolism that almost inevitably happens when these GI symptoms have been occurring for too long. People often feel that if their symptoms don't happen all the time, then it's okay. But even that's not okay. Like, we shouldn't even know we have a gastrointestinal system. We should eat our food and be none the wiser that anything's going on in here, except when we need to move our bowels or something. But that's about the only time we should be aware that we have a gastrointestinal system. So anything that isn't consistent with that is not normal and deserves to be further evaluated through a functional medicine lens. Even rashes are huge. A lot of skin issues derive from gastrointestinal issues. So I'll have people run the gamut in terms of skin symptoms. They'll say that they have hives or they're allergic to the sun. Some people are really sensitive to heat and sunlight. Other people have eczema, psoriasis, or acne. Very often this is because of a gastrointestinal issue going on that's undiagnosed. Not only do they have symptoms, but sometimes these symptoms have literally been going on for decades. These people have been suffering with these symptoms for decades, and they end up going to the dermatologist for the skin issue, the therapist and psychiatrist for the anxiety, sometimes going on drugs for the weight gain, or ADHD medications like Adderall or Vyvanse for the fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and brain fog. That's also another common symptom I didn't mention before. People end up going to so many different doctors and being put on medications that could potentially be quite harmful in the long run or have side effects. Or if they don't want to expose themselves to the medications, they just suffer through for years, trying different supplements over the counter, doing all they can to keep themselves going. Meanwhile, they're just circling the drain over time. If they're fortunate enough to know about integrative medicine, they'll come and see it. Or perhaps a friend will refer them. Your body sends signals on purpose, and even if they're once in a while signals or daily signals, they're meaningful and shouldn't be ignored. But the problem is that because we can't find the answers with testing, we've learned to normalize body dysfunction. An astounding 60 to 70% of Gen Z and millennials experience gastrointestinal symptoms of some kind, but may or may not tell their doctor. And often, when they do tell their doctor, unless it's something severe like blood in their stools or severe abdominal pain, not much is done. Because the vast majority of the time when we do the testing, we don't find anything wrong. A colonoscopy often will not find anything. An endoscopy will often not find anything, or find things that are nonspecific, like a little bit of gastritis, for example. And then that person might be put on some antacids for a while. And because the antacids reduce the acidity, they feel better temporarily, and then they go off the antacids, and the symptoms either come back right away or they come back after a short period of time. Colonoscopies are important, especially for colon cancer screening for those at high risk or those over the age of 50. But they often don't find very much, especially in younger populations like Gen Z and millennials. Gen Z and millennials have more gastrointestinal symptoms than older generations, partly due to the tremendous stress they've grown up with and the go, go, go society they've had to grow up in as well. So why don't endoscopies and colonoscopies show us what's going on? That's because they're looking for diseases. For example, colitis, ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, cancer, diverticulosis or diverticulitis. And then CAT scans that can find appendicitis if it exists, or what we call bowel obstructions if the bowels are not moving and everything's kind of stuck. That can be due to scar tissue. Things like vagus nerve dysfunction just don't show up on a test. It's not easy to find out if someone has low stomach acid or low GI motility. Those tests exist, but they're not often done. If we look at what causes these symptoms, the most common cause is stress. Stress will slow down the gut. Stress will reduce stomach acid. Stress will also suppress your immune system, make it more likely that infections take hold. These infections will not show up on endoscopies, colonoscopies, CAT scans, or laparoscopies, leaving millions of people without answers. Microbiome imbalances don't show up on CAT scans and all the other tests we just talked about. And the imbalance of the microbiome is what causes anxiety, has a lot to do with the fatigue and the brain fog. And then we have to ask what disturbs the microbiome. Stress all by itself can do that. Your diet affects the microbiome as well. So eating a highly processed diet can cause imbalances in the microbiome. But the most common thing is the presence of infection. Again, not food poisoning, but these chronic, silent, quiet infections that wreak havoc in people's guts, such as what we call SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIFO, which is small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Occasionally we'll find a parasite, but those are way less common. Sometimes we'll also see co-infections in the large intestines. Someone will have a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or SIBO, and some of those bacteria will, what we call translocate. They will migrate down into the large intestine. And so we'll see abnormal bacteria in the stool as well. Now, the problem with the stool tests done at the regular labs by your gastroenterologist or your primary care physician is that they're not often considered to be what we call pathogens, what we call infectious bacteria. So they will be tossed to the side and the test will come back normal, even though there are these weird abnormal bacteria in the stool that have mingled with the microbiome and wreaked havoc in them. So these tests will come back normal when they're really not. Reinterpreting some of these tests is critically important to really know what's going on in someone's gastrointestinal system. There's still a lot of controversy about SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Mainstream medicine really did not want to admit this infection was real, and they were forced to admit it in January of 2024, when the data was simply overwhelming that it was, in fact, a real thing. But still to this day, even though it's been almost 2 years, many physicians dismiss SIBO, or they'll just write a prescription for the antibiotic that's used to treat SIBO without even testing, leading to an incomplete treatment and persistence of symptoms. Part of the reason that we resisted SIBO so much is because in medical school we were taught that it just didn't exist. And we believed it. When reports started to come out talking about this thing called SIBO, we dismissed it because we were so convinced that the small intestine was a sterile environment and there were no bacteria there. And the only way we could introduce infection into the small intestine is if someone was stabbed or if we stabbed them while operating on them with a scalpel. And so in the absence of those circumstances, we didn't think that SIBO was just a thing that could just happen out of the blue. And in fact, that's exactly what happens with SIBO. It's a thing that kind of happens out of the blue, except it's super quiet. It's not like food poisoning. Like when we have food poisoning, we know we have food poisoning. Like there is no doubt that we have food poisoning. We have this sudden onset of nausea, vomiting, abdominal discomfort, cramping, loose stools. And then just as quickly as it comes, it goes, right? So it might be gone in a day or two, and then we feel more or less normal and we move on. SIBO is not like that. It's the super sneaky, under the radar, quiet, not food poisoning type of presentation. So it leads to things like a little bit of bloating, a little bit gassy. I feel like I have a basketball in my stomach all the time. Like, this is what people say, like they feel like their stomach is never flat. or they don't eat as much because if they eat anything like a normal meal, they will bloat. Or they know to avoid certain foods. If they eat dairy or gluten, they'll bloat even more. This is how SIBO actually shows up. And the vast majority of the time, when we ask enough questions, we'll find out that they started having this onset of symptoms during a very stressful part of their lives. The stress was so overwhelming that they weren't really paying attention to the GI stuff and they just kept dismissing it because it wasn't like food poisoning, right? Food poisoning lays you out for 2 days. There's no muscling your way through food poisoning. But SIBO, you can just keep going and just keep dismissing the bloating, the occasional loose stools. Keep dismissing the occasional constipation, the occasional heartburn, because of the chaos of the stress in life in general. And so what that does is it gives the bacteria time to really settle in there and divide and multiply. And again, we won't read about this yet, but SIBO essentially originates from everyday bacteria that we're exposed to all the time. Bacteria that might be on a cup that we drink out of, or the utensils that we eat with, an apple, a salad. Our environment is constantly teeming with bacteria. And that's supposed to be normal for us. We're supposed to live with trillions of different bacteria around us all the time, right? If we're gardening, we're playing with bacteria. But that's not supposed to be of any significant consequence to us because we have built-in systems to defend us from that. The problem is when you're under stress, your immune system is not functioning on all cylinders. Some may get through. So you may have that apple and you may swallow a few thousand bacteria and maybe 100 slip by. Same thing with a salad. Same thing when you're drinking some water. Next thing you know, you have thousands and thousands of bacteria in your gut. We're supposed to have acid in our stomach so that as the bacteria end up in the stomach, that's supposed to kill them. But stress reduces the acid that the stomach makes. And so that layer of defense is not there when we're under chronic stress. So those bacteria can get by. There are other layers of defense in our immune system as well that's supposed to protect us. But if it's not firing on all cylinders, it may not be there to protect us from all the bacteria. Inevitably, some get through. And they're in there multiplying and dividing. They grow exponentially. And that will happen over perhaps a few months or even a few years. And we'll just feel these mild, annoying symptoms the whole time. We might make some dietary adjustments and that feels better. We might get prescribed an antacid and it feels better, right? Heartburn is another symptom. It's not because your stomach acid is too high. It's because the bacteria causing the infection also produce acids. And so they produce acid over and above what your stomach makes. And so very often the antacids seem to work. And so people continue to take them. The problem with antacids is they block your absorption. The problem with SIBO and SIFO is it does the same thing. It also blocks your absorption. And again, this was something that we just thought was impossible in medical school, right? We learned that the small intestine is like 20, 25 feet long. It's like a coiled snake in the abdomen, takes up the whole abdominal cavity practically, and it's very redundant. There are multiple places where we absorb the same type of food all throughout the small intestine. So the idea that something could block absorption was just ridiculous in our opinion. But what we find with SIBO and what makes this infection so shockingly efficient at knocking people down is that they actually block the things that you use to absorb your own food. They block bile salts, for example. We need bile salts from the gallbladder to absorb fat. The bacteria that cause SIBO literally deactivate that bile salt so it can't function for you to absorb your own fat. So that way the fat sits there in your gut for them to thrive on. If we were to do a test if someone is absorbing their fat, very often we'll see that they have fat malabsorption. There are multiple places along the small intestine where you absorb fat. So it's not that they're blocking all of those different locations in the small intestine, although they will block some. It's that they're knocking out absorption from the root. They're going to where the enzymes, bile salts, the molecules that literally break our food down for us so we can absorb them, that's what they're blocking. Interestingly, cancer cells behave very similarly. There are cancer cells that can deactivate vitamin D. And so the bacteria that cause SIBO are intelligent in that way as well. So what happens is as people are in the chaos of their lives and during these stressful periods where this infection can take hold, they're just muscling through. Meanwhile, they're getting more fatigued over time. They're getting more mood disturbances, whether it's irritability, depression, anxiety, premenstrual symptoms, inflammation, weight gain, brain fog. These things start to slip into the picture along with the bloating that started out as one of the earlier symptoms. This is happening because the microbiome is being disturbed and you're not absorbing your own food. So not only do they block your ability to absorb, they send junk down into the large intestine where the microbiome lives. And that disturbs the microbiome tremendously because they're very sensitive. We're supposed to have an immune system and an ecosystem in the gut that is tenaciously protecting the gut and the environment of the gut so that our microbiome is safe. But when there's an infection above them, constantly making acids, methane gas, hydrogen sulfide, and other gases and toxins as a result of their existence, that seeps down into the large intestine. And sometimes the bacteria causing the SIBO also migrate down into the large intestine. And they invade the microbiome. Now they're competing with them for nourishment and making their toxic junk right in the microbiome. And so the microbiome can die off. They will sometimes overgrow, and this is where the name SIBO even came from, is the overgrowth of the good bacteria. SIBO is not an overgrowth of good bacteria. It's an actual infection with foreign bacteria that don't belong inside the human body. We'll see both. And when we do microbiome testing, we see some species are overgrown, some species are just not there in reasonable amounts. We'll see that they're less than detectable levels. Some are normal, some are not as disturbed. More commonly, we see that in general, the microbiome is simply not functioning properly. Even though they're there in semi-normal counts or even overgrown, we'll see that they're not making what we call short-chain fatty acids. Those short-chain fatty acids are critically important. The microbiome has 4 million genes within itself that we need for our own body functions. Their health equals our health. 4 million genes, that's a lot of genes. We only have 25,000. So our adaptability is because of the microbiome. So anything that disturbs them will disturb our ability to adapt. And so this is why we're seeing the association of microbiome disturbances with all kinds of symptoms. This is where the anxiety comes from, because neurotransmitters that manage our mood are controlled by the genes of the microbiome. They make vitamins for us. They make clotting factors for us. People that have easy bruising, that's often a result of the disturbance of the microbiome. And again, that's usually due to an infection or stress, or both. And so this can easily lead to burnout, whether it's just stress doing it or if it's stress plus an infection. The other reason that in mainstream medicine we just did not want to admit that SIBO existed is because the test for it is not wonderful. It can be quite inaccurate. And so sometimes we'll see that it comes back normal, even in people that actually have SIBO. In functional medicine, we'll do a backup test where we do a functional stool analysis. And we'll look at the microbiome. And if we see that there are, quote unquote, additional bacteria in the microbiome, or even some infectious bacteria in the stool, if we see that coupled with signs of malabsorption, which is a small intestine process, we absorb food through the small intestine only. There's no other place in the body where we absorb food. So if someone has malabsorption and additional bacteria in their stool that's not part of the microbiome, the likelihood that they have SIBO is quite high, even when the breath test comes back normal. Because the breath test is so inaccurate, millions of people are undiagnosed and untreated and think that these symptoms are just normal. And then they end up in burnout. They crash and burn at some point. Now, what determines when they crash and burn has to do with how much reserve energy they have. If they're able to maintain proper sleep, manage their stress better, if they're eating well enough, and they're still absorbing to some extent enough to meet their demands, they won't crash and burn as much as someone who's not. And again, we'll see some people catch on to the idea that, oh, the microbiome is disturbed, so let me take some probiotics to rebalance it. You don't want to do that. With emerging data that we have, we're showing that rebalancing the microbiome with probiotics is not safe. Not that the probiotics are toxic, but because the microbiome has 4 million genes, all those genes are interdependent and we don't know how they function with each other. So even if we're just replacing one strain, we're going to influence several strains and we don't even know where the end of that is. What ends up happening with probiotics is that we end up imbalancing the microbiome in another direction and just causing more problems down the road anyway. Every once in a while, people feel better on the probiotics, so they think that the issue is done. The danger with that is if you do have an infection, you're going to continue to have malabsorption. So while your bloating might get better, the fatigue won't necessarily, and the other symptoms that you're having, the anxiety and the other issues, may not be benefited by just taking that probiotic. Studies are even emerging to suggest that even after antibiotics, we should not take probiotics. Because what we're finding is it actually slows down the healing process because of the way that probiotics imbalance the microbiome. How do we deal with microbiome imbalances so that we can help people get out of burnout? The first thing, again, is to make sure you don't have an infection, because if you have an infection, that's what's imbalancing the microbiome. So the treatment for that is not to take probiotics because you're just putting fuel on the fire. It's also not to take prebiotics, like increasing your fiber, because then you're feeding the enemy. So the solution in the case of infection is to treat the infection. Then the microbiome will just rebalance itself. It's genius at that. So all we really need to do is get the albatross off its back and leave it alone and feed it with some prebiotics. That's when the fibers come in and all of that to help support the microbiome by just giving it the food that it relies on. And then it will regain its balance and regain its function without us messing with probiotics. So the gastrointestinal symptoms are one of the earliest signs of burnout, even before the fatigue sets in. So it's important never to ignore gastrointestinal symptoms. And if you have been to your physician and you have seen a gastroenterologist and you still don't have answers, see a functional or integrative medical doctor. There's also a big difference between how SIBO is treated with regular medicine versus functional medicine. Johns Hopkins University did studies on SIBO treatment back in 2014. And it showed that there were natural antimicrobials, or herbs, spices, and essential oils that were just as effective as antibiotics for the treatment of SIBO. Now, this was just hydrogen-based SIBO. For methane-based SIBO, that study would not necessarily apply. But this was in the early days of studying SIBO, so we hadn't really done a lot of research on the different types of treatments that are needed with methane-based SIBO. Now, hydrogen-based SIBO versus methane-based SIBO is essentially the bacteria that cause the infection as a result of their metabolism, as a result of them eating your food that they prevented you from digesting and absorbing. They will make gases. They can make methane gases. They can make hydrogen sulfide as just a byproduct of their metabolism. And so this is how we diagnose SIBO. We look for these gases. And that gives us a sense of who the bacteria are. There is no test for SIBO that will tell us who the bacteria are. And that's what makes it really challenging. So we have to rely on the bacteria that are causing the SIBO to actually make the gases that we look for. If people are not eating the foods that trigger the bacteria to make the gases, the test comes back normal, even though you have an infection. You have to have a physician looking at your test results who is expert at treating SIBO and also understands how fallible the testing is. So we know that there are natural things that we can use to treat SIBO. Now, most conventional physicians will not prescribe the natural agents. They will prescribe the antibiotics because that's what we're comfortable with when we go to medical school. The problem with that is SIBO is very tricky to treat. And by the time we diagnose it, those bacteria have been in there for a while, sometimes literally decades. And they get extremely intelligent. Not only do they deactivate your ability to absorb your own food, but they get really entrenched through the formation of what we call biofilms. They will make these films out of your food to add insult to injury and just hide under them so that you can't get to them, so that your immune system can't get to them, so that antibiotics can't even get to them. Antibiotics literally just bounce off these biofilms. If you've ever looked on the surface of a lake, you'll see this slimy film on the surface of the water. That's a biofilm. Microbes make them. The same thing happens when there's an infection in the body. And this is how the infection can evade your immune system and be there for as long as decades. So the antibiotics that are prescribed, if there are biofilms involved, will do almost nothing for the infection. This is why we see that the antibiotics are only about 50% effective. And this is for hydrogen-based SIBO. If you have methane-based SIBO or a combination of hydrogen with methane, adding another antibiotic called neomycin will increase the effectiveness of the treatment. But again, nothing is 100% for SIBO. Even the natural agents are only about 50-ish%, maybe 70%, depending on the study that you're looking at. But there's literally nothing that's 100% for SIBO, because with SIBO, there can be up to 10, 11, 12 different species of bacteria, which is astounding. We don't usually see that in infections. For example, when someone has a bladder infection, they'll isolate out one bacteria and they'll be able to identify that bacteria at the lab, and then they'll tell you exactly which antibiotic will kill it. It's very easy to treat a bladder infection, but we don't have that for SIBO. So this is another reason that so many people never get diagnosed or properly treated, even if they are diagnosed. I've had people come in after they've had 2-3 rounds of antibiotics with other conventional physicians, and they just kept getting re-prescribed the same antibiotic. The problem is if it didn't work the first time, it's not going to work any other time either, because the reason it's not working is usually due to the biofilms, or there are just so many different species that particular antibiotic is just not effective for. So it might kill some of the species causing the SIBO, but it won't kill all of them. So usually what we need to do is prescribe what we call biofilm disruptors. Those are enzymes and what we call bismuth thiol, which digest through the biofilms since they are made of food. Some are thick and tenacious, and bismuth thiol is designed for the thicker, more tenacious ones. We need to actually get the bacteria exposed, available to be killed, and not hiding under the biofilms. Something needs to chisel down and destroy the biofilms. So these can be prescribed. Usually this is with a functional medical doctor and not with a conventional medical doctor. You may have to use a biofilm disruptor for up to a year. Studies show that it can take up to a year to digest or disrupt all the different biofilms that might be involved. And then again, you don't want to keep treating the infection with the same thing over and over. So the idea is to switch it up and to use different methods. So there aren't really any other antibiotics for SIBO because, again, there are so many different strains of bacteria. The natural agents contain multiple ingredients. If you look at what we call Fc-cytyl dysbiocide protocol, for example, you'll see that there are up to 10, 11, 12 different ingredients. These are herbs and spices, essential oils. For example, the Fc-cytyl dysbiocide protocol has things like wormwood, yarrow, stomona root and extract, French tarragon, horsetail, thyme, podarco, stinging nettle. So there's a whole cocktail of different natural things in it that have antimicrobial effects. And so there's a decent chance that it's going to kill a good number of the bacteria. There's no one protocol that kills all the bacteria. So what we usually end up having to do is to switch the protocols up after each treatment phase until we have gotten all of the bacteria that are responsible for the SIBO. SIBO is almost never a one and done. And if you're not getting your care from a SIBO expert, they may not know that. The other aspect is the malabsorption that takes place. So there will inevitably be multiple vitamin and mineral deficiencies that people with SIBO have. And again, unless you're doing functional vitamin and mineral or micronutrient testing, you're going to miss them because they don't really show up in blood work until they're pretty severe. And usually there are only a few things that are tested for. So you might have your iron tested, your B12, your vitamin D. They may or may not be deficient in your blood work. We usually don't see that blood levels actually be in the deficiency range until they're pretty severely depleted. So in functional testing, we'll do either urine testing or what we call cellular-based testing so that we look at the micronutrients from a different angle. So we're looking at the storage levels of nutrients in the body and not just what's floating in the bloodstream. Because again, your blood is a prioritized area. So it's usually a normalized environment, and we typically will not see vitamin and mineral deficiencies until they are severe. This is why very often people aren't even usually tested for vitamin and mineral deficiencies because it's not common that their blood work is abnormal. So this is something that might be missed unless you're doing functional testing. And so between getting the microbiome to function better and getting the nutrient levels back up, this is what closes the gap that gets people out of burnout. And then looking at stress hormones is also extremely important. Now, those are not necessarily gastrointestinal, but when we look at root causes, why do people get GI symptoms? It's not food poisoning. It's not that you ate something bad. These are everyday bacteria that we're exposed to all the time. So it's not like, oh, I went out with friends and I ate something and, there was a bug in my food. That's not SIBO. It's stress induced. We're all under stress. And this is why SIBO is so common and GI symptoms are so common. Now you have to be careful when you look at studies because the studies are all over the map. Some of the studies base their definitions of GI symptoms on very strict criteria, which makes us think that not that many people have GI symptoms. However, there are other studies on the other side of the spectrum where upwards of 60% of Gen Z and millennials will report having at least one GI symptom in the prior week. GI symptoms are much more common than what studies show, especially when people underreport their symptoms because they've been told they were normal for so long. Working on stress is extremely important, and considering getting your stress hormones evaluated is another strategy to help reduce the recurrence of the GI symptoms once they're resolved. So how do we start listening to our gut again? What is normal? Normal is I feel no symptoms. I have no bloating. I have no heartburn. I have no nausea. I can eat a normal amount of food and not feel full. The other thing I forgot to mention is not feeling like having breakfast. That's a GI symptom. If you wake up and you're not hungry within about 30, 45 minutes of having gotten up, that's a GI symptom. That's a sign of a low metabolism, and that's likely due to some type of irregularity in the gastrointestinal system. People think that's normal, like, oh, I just listen to my body and I eat when I'm hungry. But if you have a low metabolism, your body may not be functioning well enough to tell you when it's hungry. It's important to note, like, oh, I'm not hungry in the morning. I skip breakfast because I'm not hungry. That's a GI symptom. You should have a normal amount of hunger after you've fasted all night long. You should move your bowels about 2 to 3 times a day. They should be well formed, like a ripe banana, but brown, with nothing mixed in there. There should be no mucus, and it should not float on the water. It should sink like an anvil. So if you have little pellets, or if you have to strain to move your bowels, if you skip days without having a bowel movement, or if they're loose all the time, or loose with your menstrual cycles, these are all not normal. Also, you shouldn't have fatigue after meals. You should actually be invigorated by a meal, not fatigued. So if you're feeling more tired after you eat, that may be a sign that you're not digesting and absorbing your food properly and you're not getting the nutrients from that food, and perhaps it's backfiring and causing inflammation. So if you're having any GI symptoms, I encourage you to see a functional or integrative medical doctor to get a full evaluation so that you can restore the most important body function that you have, which is the function of your gastrointestinal system. The gastrointestinal system is what runs our metabolism and fuels our metabolism. Burnout is usually a direct result of something going on in the gut. Even if it's not infectious, it could be stress. Some of the things to do: make sure you don't skip breakfast, especially if you're feeling tired. Chew a little bit longer than you think you should. Do some breath work. That's really important for the vagus nerve. There's really no exercise we need to do for the vagus nerve except to breathe properly. So a lot of times the vagus nerve is just simply suppressed because it's part of what we call the parasympathetic nervous system. If you're under chronic stress, especially if you're shallow breathing, which we do unconsciously, we don't know we're shallow breathing, that suppresses the vagus nerve. So there's no exercise that's going to fix that except for doing breath work. Getting the body to understand that it is not under threat comes from your breath. That is what will awaken the vagus nerve to get it to function better. The vagus nerve is kind of like the be all and end all of our gastrointestinal system as far as nervous system input to it. Mindful eating is really important. Mindful eating is simply when you kind of immerse yourself in the meal. Every flavor, the texture, the experience of the food, being in gratitude for the food, being joyful while you eat. These are all things that help you digest and absorb better so that you can maximize what you get out of your food. And for more personalized information, I recommend that you know your dynamic metabolic type. Once you know your dynamic metabolic type, you can apply that to the 4 pillars of wellness, with eat being one of the most important. The other pillars are also extremely important. How you move matters, how you rest matters, and how your body removes toxins matters. They all are interdependent and flow with each other. Knowing your dynamic metabolic type helps you to know how to address the 4 pillars of wellness. You can't solve burnout without optimizing your gut function because it is literally your metabolic engine. So if you have GI symptoms, don't ignore them. Keep searching for answers and always listen to your gut. So if you want to know your dynamic metabolic type, I invite you to join our 7-day Metabolic Reset Challenge, where we show you how to determine your dynamic metabolic type and apply it to the 4 pillars of wellness to start getting yourself out of burnout in as little as 7 days. We've had amazing results with our 7-day challenge. We've had people get amazing sleep after they had insomnia. We've had people's diabetes improve within the week, weight loss, reduction of inflammation, and just feeling better, less fatigue, more invigorated, happy, and relieved to know that there is a path out of burnout. If you want to take a deep dive, I invite you to our Wellness Warrior 9-week transformation program, where we dive deep into dynamic metabolic typing and the 4 pillars of wellness. For more information, visit our website, awakenedwellnessnow.com. I hope you found this podcast to be beneficial. If so, please share it with someone you know who might be suffering through some GI symptoms, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing more content so we can help you and your loved ones resolve or prevent burnout. And as always, thank you for listening. And until next time, many, many blessings. Thank you.